ALIA VIC would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we work and live. I'm coming from Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and extend that to the nations of all the lands that people are joining us from. We pay our respects to the elders past and present, and sovereignty has never been ceded. We also acknowledge the First Nations people's rich history of knowledge keeping and knowledge management that is an inspiration to us all. So first up, some introductions. I'm James. I'm one of the co-conveners of ALIA VIC, and I'm acting as the moderator today. If you have any technical problems with your Zoom joining us, all of that, the person to talk to is our wonderful secretary, Michael Barry. So he's going to be monitoring all the technical side of the recording and the interaction today. So yeah, please, if you're having problems, chuck them in the chat, and Michael will get onto that for you. Also, our wonderful social media coordinator, Jade.
Hi, everyone.
She's appearing as ALIA Groups today to make sure that we can manage the stuff properly. She's going to be managing questions. So if you do have questions during the first part of the session, if you want to put them in chat, she'll collate them and we can work through them when we get to the questions section. And I'd also like to acknowledge our chair and the other co-convener, Tim and Ellen, who will be panelists today. Before we get any further, I also would like to acknowledge RACO, the Paran Mechanics Institute Victorian History Library, and the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. They were going to be providing support for the event when it was in person. Unfortunately, due to the ongoing lockdown conditions in Melbourne, we were unable to have it in person, but we do still thank them for the support they had offered. So with that done, let's get into it. Today, we're talking about the Dewey Decimal Classification System. Now, this was created in 1876 by a man who, if we're being honest, the less said about the better. And it has grown to be the most widely used library classification system in the world. It's used in more than 100 countries and many thousand libraries throughout the world. But should it be? To help us answer this, we're joined by four amazing panelists. They've all got aspects with different, they've all got experience with different aspects of this discussion. Ellen Coates, Leonie Burke, Clara Hanlon, and Tim Gillis-Jones. They're each going to be providing some insight into their engagement with Dewey, and then we're going to open up to a discussion between the panelists and get some questions from the audience. And remember, if you have any questions during the first part of the session, please feel free to put them in the chat for Jade. So first up, we have Ellen, who is the Collections Librarian and Volunteer Coordinator at the Paran Mechanics Institute Victorian History Library. She's also one of ALIA VIC's co-conveners, and in her spare time, she's an historian and writer and runs the blog Historical Ragbag. In her role at the PMI, Ellen manages a specialised history collection using a modified version of Dewey. She'll be talking about using and refining this adapted version of Dewey for the PMI's specific needs.
Thanks, James. Thank you for the introduction and welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see more than 70 people interested in learning about Dewey. So very briefly, I'm going to start by explaining what the PMI is, just to give you some context, but as I have 5 minutes, it will be brief. So the Paran Mechanics Institute Victorian History Library, which we abbreviate to PMI for obvious reasons, second oldest library in Victoria, so we were founded in 1854. James works at the oldest library. And so we actually predate Dewey. So we believe we originally sorted stuff by subject, or sort of books by subject and location, but we don't have some of our original records, unfortunately. So we specialise in Victorian history, and we're dedicated to collecting, preserving and promoting the multiplicity of voices that make up Victoria's history. So basically, we use a modified version of Dewey, essentially because as a specialist library, Dewey is just not specific enough for us. So I didn't come up with this system. I've worked with it and adapted it as we've sort of moved forward. And we have a cataloging and procedures document where we record most of our modifications. So from a very basic level, the reason we don't use straight Dewey is because we sort everything by place. So if we can possibly put a book with place, we will. So we go to 2 lines of numbers using the region, and then start using letters to make it more specific after that. So to give a really specific example, say there was a book about mining in Bendigo, it would be at 994.54, then BEND for Bendigo, and then MIN for mining. So we have a whole bunch of even further down stratification, which Dewey just doesn't allow us to get to. We find this is how our members want to use the collection, because everyone wants to know, sample everything about Seymour. They don't want a whole bunch of random books about churches or schools or that kind of thing. And because we sort by place, we stratify beyond place. So say we do have other books too. So say it was about mining more generally in Victoria or Australia, it would be with 622, which is the general mining number. And then we'd stratify beyond that for other reasons. So yeah, we go to 2 lines of numbers and then start adding letters. And then beyond that, we have further designators. I'm not going to run through all of them because we've got quite a lot, and they are somewhat codified. Most of them are. I started writing them down when I started there about 5 years ago. I think I've done the majority, but not all of them. So for example, Ballarat's quite a good example. So Ballarat is 994.57, so that's the Ballarat region. We get our regions from this very old, but quite still reasonably accurate Dewey region book. So 994.57 BALL. And then say it was about schools in Ballarat, it would be Edu after that. If it was mainly pictorial, we use PIC, which can be really useful for finding books to put on display. Natural history is NAT. Any kind of religious institution is REL. You get the picture for those sort of ones. And then we have ones for sort of minority groups. So say it was specifically about women, thanks Michael, in Ballarat, we have WOM after that. So we use these secondary designators for non-placed areas too. So for example, if we had a book about steam trains in Victoria, it'd be 385.361 Vic to keep all the books about steam trains in Victoria in one spot. And yes, we do have multiples of them. And it's really useful for anything that stretches beyond a specific region too. So say a river, for example, is 551.483, and then say it was about the Murray, it would be MUR. So essentially the point of this is to make the resources more discoverable within the collection. And we work with it to change stuff when we identify problem areas. So for example, we found a real problem area with private schools in Melbourne because their alumni keep writing books about them, and quite a few of them are in the same geographic location. So we had a particular problem with having a lot of books from Kew. That, for example, with Kew, there's a lot of private schools in Kew, which is 994.51 KEW Edu. We end up with about 40 books because I think there's a Wesley campus in Kew and a whole bunch of other ones. So then we started adding school designators after that to keep all of those books together and accessible. We had a similar problem with Battle of Eureka. Well, I don't necessarily want to define it as a battle. They were dispersed through all of the Ballarat books, but it got to the point, this was before I started actually, we wanted to keep them all in one spot. So there's a lot of them. So we use 994.57, then BALE for Eureka to keep all of those together and not getting mixed up with all the other general Ballarat history. And we use them for other areas like we designate general Greater Melbourne as MELB and Melbourne City as MELC. The biggest change I've made since I started there is the Indigenous collection. So our Indigenous collection is one of our highest use areas. So we go to 305.801 to keep them all together because they often don't conform to a specific region or town, and they don't fit with that specific town history. I started trying to work out another way to make it more accessible. So we do regions underneath that. So 305.801, so Vixen, and we use the IATSIS's First Nations map to try and determine that. And I talked to IATSIS and the Koori Heritage Centre They've all got slightly different systems. So I basically went through the collection, came up with a range of other subjects to use as designators. As I'm sure I'm hitting my time limit, I won't go through all of them. But for there we go. Yeah, we keep all the language books together. So it keeps all the dictionaries in one spot. Books about missions and missionaries go together. So basically, it narrows it down. So like a good example is the Coranderrk mission. That would be 305.801 VIC MELB COR. So all the books on Coranderrk are in one spot. It's an ongoing and changing process. So whenever we identify a new area that needs to be changed, we'll often get a volunteer to work on it. So I've got someone working on street directories at the moment, or she will be when we're allowed back on site. So all street directories is 912, but we needed to define it by place, by maker, and by year to keep them together. So, for example, a street directory from Morgan's from 1952 for Melbourne would be 912 MELB MOR 1952. So we record all our modifications as much as we can, and this flexibility allows us to adapt the discoverability of the collection, particularly to highlight minority groups and make that more findable for them, and make it more findable and more understandable for members as well. So I find if I tell them that you can go by the first 4 letters of the town, people can actually find things fairly simply, but keeping it findable for staff as well. And that is a very brief summary of how the PMI's modified Dewey to make it work. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. That was really great. Next up, we have Leonie. Now, she's been cataloguing and training library staff for longer than she cares to remember. One of her earliest cataloguing positions was at the Victorian Railways Technical Library, which was then in the process of converting to Dewey from the Universal Decimal Classification System. She also worked at Monash University Library, which featured a number of in-house adaptations of Dewey, primarily in mathematics and literature. She is currently employed as a cataloguer for the School's Information Service, SCIS. Leonie will reflect on the various implementations of Dewey she has encountered in her professional life to date, ranging from a specialist technical library to academic and school libraries. Is there ever a case for using Dewey out of the box? Thank you, Leonie.
Thanks, James, and it's lovely to be here, and thank you for that introduction. So I'll start off with the Victorian Railways Technical Library, which, as James said, was in the process of converting from UDC to Dewey. Now, UDC works really well as a faceted system and for information retrieval, and it's widely used in special libraries, but the librarian Maureen had found that the users were a little bit baffled by it. It's not so good as a shelf location device, and so she had made the decision to change the classification. So when I got there, things were a little bit scattered on the shelves because at the time there was still a card catalogue and it was very time consuming to reprint cards and relabel books. So things just tended to sort of muddle along together to a certain degree, with newer acquisitions outplacing the old. For a special library, the Victorian Railways Technical Library was very broad, really, because at that time the railways were quite a self-contained industry. They had even their own bakery and uniform manufacturers, as well as their vast industrial enterprise out at Newport and a wide range of administration and management support. So the library collection covered all of those different areas. Even so, the policy was to try and avoid using the specific transport numbers and government policy numbers if possible. So say you had a book on a management of a government railway enterprise in an urban area, you wouldn't put that with the railway number, you'd put that at management. So there was an attempt to try and make sure things weren't all concentrated in the specific rail transport areas, which in Dewey are split between the engineering aspects and the social and economic aspects. So Dewey actually worked really well in that library, probably because it had a fairly broad collection to start with. Okay, I'll now talk about the literature classification at Monash University Library. Now, Monash was the first Victorian university to be established since the University of Melbourne was formed back in the 1850s. So I think the idea of having a brand new library to play with kind of went to the librarians' heads a little bit, and they got a little bit carried away with establishing their own unique classification systems. Now, the literature one was really great because it organised things so that the works of authors weren't fragmented on the shelves the way they are with Dewey. As you may know, Dewey classifies literature first by language and then by form, but this was avoided in the Monash classification. Now, this continued to be used right up until, I think, around the early 2000s. At that time, though, a lot of the collection was being moved into offline storage. There was far less browsing of the huge stacks, and management was very concerned about the cost of having every literature book that came into the library having to be reclassified. So the decision was made to change over to straight Dewey, which was simply, obviously simplified the process for copy cataloguing. The original cataloguers had quite a big learning curve because, as you may know, Dewey has very complex number building instructions for literature, and this was quite unlike anything they'd been used to. Of course, they did have some experience with other aspects of Dewey, so it wasn't completely foreign. But they rose to the task, and as far as I know, everyone there is happily classifying using straight Dewey now. And finally, I'd like to mention the school's Catalogue Information Service, which catalogues library resources on behalf of Australian and New Zealand libraries. Now, SCIS has a general policy of faithfulness to DDC as published, and here I'm quoting from the SCIS standards, which have documented every decision that SCIS has made about the use of Dewey. However, it doesn't embrace a number of the optional provisions in DDC. Perhaps the most significant is that of using the permanently unassigned number 298 for the beliefs, spirituality and creation stories of Aboriginal peoples. These are never classed with folklore, but with this permanently unassigned religious number that SCIS has taken for its use. Another area in which SCIS has applied its own local interpretation, in this case it's basically ignoring the DDC instructions, is to class works on curricula and teaching of specific subjects at the primary level with the subject rather than with education as Dewey would have it. And another departure is the treatment of fiction, where all fictional works, whether they're picture books, little readers, stories, novels, graphic novels, and even films and television programs, which are stories rather than documentaries, are all classed at F for fiction. The other thing I'll just briefly mention is that SCIS assigns both full and abridged Dewey numbers to all its records, except for fiction, as it's defined above. And this is not done by using the segmentation marks, as you might notice in Web Dewey or in the records in Libraries Australia, but actually two separate classification numbers are added to each record. And that means that school library users can download whichever version they prefer with an option that's set in their SCIS user profile. SCIS also restricts number expansion in various ways where the classification is considered too detailed. The primary consideration is always the usefulness to its school library users, with a preference for broad classification and shorter numbers. That's a very brief overview of some of the changes that SCIS makes, and there are others, but sort of within that environment, there is also a certain degree of faithfulness to DDC in many of the other areas. And if you're interested in the SCIS standards, they're available on the web. You can just do a search for SCIS cataloguing standards and you'll find them there. So thank you.
Thank you, Leonie. That was really interesting through a lot of the different ways that Dewey has been customised. Next up, we have Claire, who is a librarian in a university by day and volunteer community archivist by night. Sounds like a superhero. Claire has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology and Psychology and a Master of Information Management, and is passionate about supporting independent community-based archives, encouraging critical, creative and collective reflection across the glamour sector and beyond it, and making critical knowledge, theories and histories accessible within and beyond the academy. Claire is going to give a brief overview of some of the problematic histories and legacies of Dewey. They will critique the idea that libraries and librarians are neutral, discuss some of the creative and caring ways library workers and communities have challenged and continue to challenge and change these systems, and suggest ways you can challenge discrimination in library classification too. Take it away, Claire.
Thank you, and apology, there is quite a lot to cover there, so apologies now, but I probably will go a bit over time, but hopefully not too much, and I've got a PowerPoint to help as well. So yeah, for further reading that you can do. So hopefully, yeah, I'll share my screen, get started. And hang on. Not now. I'm gonna just quickly swap. Alrighty, so I'm going to talk about querying, Dewey, classification, care, collaboration and community engagement in libraries. And I wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I also want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I also thought it might help to start by illustrating an example like of the Galawinku classification system in East Arnhem Land, which is quite recent, where they have abandoned Dewey and worked with local First Nations communities to prioritise their culture in their language. I would love to see more of this. I think also, while thinking about this, I highly recommend reading Nathan Sentence's work on the blog Archival Decolonist. Yeah, and Nathan's talked quite a bit about harmful classification of First Nations materials in Dewey. And Alyssa, or Licitations, wrote a great blog post recently on cataloguing the songlines. And there's also the Brian Deere classification in so-called Canada, so another First Nations alternative to Dewey. I don't want to spend too much time talking about Dewey himself and the system, because I feel like, yeah, Dewey has quite literally taken up too much space in libraries, so I won't take too much time. I just thought I'd illustrate a few. Yeah, I think and his dark side and the biases are increasingly well known in the sector. I think that it does help to start by talking about this, as yeah, I think it really illustrates that we are not neutral, and the dangers when we try to pretend we are. Systems are affected by the time and place in which they're developed, and Dewey's system, yeah, it reflects both his personal prejudices and experiences and backgrounds, and that of the society in which he lived. We know that he was racist, anti-Semitic, sexist. He harassed women as well, and assaulted women. Yeah, there's not many good things we can say about Dewey. And yeah, it is so widely used and has such a problematic history of classifying material related to LGBTIQ people, First Nations people, people of colour, disabled people, women, people with religions other than Christianity as well. I will mostly focus on LGBTIQ materials, given my lived experiences and professional experiences as well. But there are, and given the time limit, but there are many issues. And I must admit, when I was learning cataloguing at library school, I really struggled with this subject until I found radical cataloguers. And then I was hooked. There are some really amazing people out there and throughout history who have been working to change the system, and they've made some good improvements. So I'll move on. So yeah, there are people working at the level, I guess the OCLC level, to change the system, but these changes are really slow, and yeah, so they're not always implemented at the local level, particularly as we see declining numbers of staff working in technical services roles in the library and increasing reliance on third parties for cataloguing and other processing of materials. So yeah, even if good changes are made, which they have been, they're not always implemented at local levels. I've highlighted a few examples from this Dewey blog, which I recommend looking up the blog. It's probably the best place I've found to easily find out about issues and updates. Ethical issues and updates. In case you are in a technical services role where you have a position to advocate for those changes, or you don't, or from any role really in the library. I've also heard about stories of librarians at other universities who sometimes request multiple copies of a book. So from multiple disciplines or interdisciplinary texts, and then they'll assign different classification numbers to the different copies so that they appear in different parts of the library, which I kind of love the idea of. But yeah, we don't really have that kind of money or space, and I don't know many libraries that would, which is a shame. As my role by day is a teaching or instruction librarian, I've really appreciated Emily Drabinski's work. Done quite a bit applying queer theory to cataloguing and librarianship to highlight that cataloguing and classification decisions are not neutral, but they're ideologically driven. And Emily Drabinski advocates for, for public services and more front-facing librarians like me to join cataloguers in changing the systems. To help people critically engage with the histories and ideologies that have shaped them. I think, and these structures should be presented as contested and in flux rather than objective and stable. I've sort of started to do this in a few classes in gender, sexuality and diversity studies, legal studies and history with students. I'm getting them to critique how language and labels have changed over time, and how our systems have not kept up with those changes, and always stressing the importance of context. There's much more I could do. Some labels the labels that classification systems use, they can be incredibly harmful when assigned to marginalized groups. They perpetuate stereotypes and myths, medicalize people and groups, reinforce false binaries. For example, LGBTIQ plus people have been shelved under abnormal psychology, perversion, derangement, neurological disorders, and social problems in services. And before, most recently landing or being shelved in sexual orientation, transgender identity, and intersexuality. Which was in 2018. That's pretty recent. And I guess a big part of the recent changes were to update or replace transgenderism with transgender identity, and transgenderists with transgender people. And that was reflecting meaning that shifted over time to become derogatory. So it's good to see that being changed. But labels can also, and some categorizing labels and categorization can also be a powerful and comforting way for people from marginalized groups to find information about themselves and connect with relevant communities. So we need to do more to help LGBTIQ and other marginalized groups find information about themselves and their communities in their own words, with their own, in our collections. And I really think folksonomies and tagging capabilities, so adding them to catalogues could be one great way to do this. I think, and there's an example of Anne, who's a librarian in Canberra, has created some amazing transgender related troves lists. They're really extensive. It's kind of the use of tags in a way. I really highly recommend looking at them. Opening up our catalogues and systems to the people I'm passionate about that, making the cataloging process accessible to everyone. There is another article quite recent by Wagner and Crowley, who talk about a number of different aspects of systemic discrimination against trans and gender non-conforming people in libraries, and that included shelving. And they cited some examples of where transgender related material was co-located on the shelves with really harmful collection items and problematic ones based on the Dewey number they were assigned. And yeah, they suggest the idea of using warning labels and also of inviting users to provide feedback to help collectively change the system. A quick example, so I've mentioned before, I've mentioned the challenging Dewey classification and equality exhibition at Melbourne Library Service a few times before in various forms, because it had a really formative impact on me as a new librarian in 2016. And it featured artists responding to work to a piece by Doreen Sullivan on the brief history of homophobia in the Dewey Decimal Classification System. And it also showcased material from the Australian Queer Archives to celebrate some of the subversive agents of social change working in libraries who have helped challenge discriminatory classification and champion equality through cataloging, collection development and promotion. And they used, they created and disseminated bibliographies, which maybe we could bring back a little bit. And it was really powerful reading about the gay librarians and gay library workers groups of the 70s who would have been limited in what they could do when being out at work, would have put their jobs at risk. But they recognized the importance of doing this work, and they and challenging discrimination, and they united through subversive cataloging, collection development. And building on this exhibition, just wanted to quickly, this is my final, like to sum up, I guess. I think that we really need to let go of some of our so-called authority and the hierarchy in classification, and to become more comfortable with change and fluidity in order to give people opportunities to interpret and describe our collections in their own words, and give them more control over how they are described, which might be quite confronting for many librarians who maybe feel like they've already lost so much authority in these changing and uncertain times. And while we have definitely made progress towards democratizing access to knowledge and away from being authoritative gatekeepers of it, we still have quite a while to go. I think we can learn a lot in libraries from our glamorous colleagues, so from museums and galleries, about creating spaces for multiple perspectives and interpretations of collections. And also we can learn from archivists about facilitating access to context. And we can do a lot more, and they can learn from us about subject and theme and thematic description. I think collaborating is always good. The We Are Here exhibition at the State Library of Victoria, in collaboration with the Australian Queer Archives, invited LGBTIQ artists to work with them, interpret the library's collections and find and explore their queer histories. Is another really great example of something we could see, it'd be great to see more of. There was a Making the Margins example as well, where we had collection items that really didn't fit neatly into any category from a range of different places as well. And it was really one of the most glamorous things I've been part of, and one of the most comfortable and safe spaces I've been in since becoming a librarian. There was a label makers exhibition at the Trove Art Institute, which invited viewers to creatively engage with labeling practices, and critically and playfully. And another glamorous example is the GlamX Lab at the University of Newcastle, which brings together GLAM knowledge with regional community history group knowledge, including a queer history group, And that really empowers community members and students and researchers to connect with, digitize, describe, and build on their collections and their knowledge about their collections. And I will finish up soon. There's just a couple of references. I can share these slides with people afterwards. Couples, yeah, further reading. And yeah, you can contact me.
Thank you, Claire. That was very interesting. And next up, we have Tim. Tim's experience is mostly in public libraries, with a brief stopover in academic libraries in England. Tim is also ALIA VIC's chair. With experience in genrefied collections at Geelong, as well as in multiple library services across Melbourne, Tim will bring their experiences of guiding end users through the Dewey system to the panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. So a brief bit of my history in library land. I graduated from the University of Wollongong with a Bachelor of Arts in European Studies and a minor in International Studies in 2011, which is a very fancy way of saying, would you like fries with that? So I came down to Melbourne 2012 and started at RMIT doing the library course, same time as Claire was doing it. And ended up working in Geelong for 3 years, working in England for 1.5 years at an academic library, coming back, and since then I've been doing the contract hopping, and I've worked at Melton, Casey Cardinia Library Service, and currently at Monash Library Service. So across that time, I've seen Dewey used and adjusted in a variety of different ways. The one that kind of gave me enough to go to this panel and have something to talk about was when Geelong opened up the Dome, the Geelong Library and Heritage Centre in 2015. We had Dewey, but we also had subjects. So everything had one of, I think it was 6 subject classifications. So bookstore style, you'd go to the art section, or you'd go to home and garden, or you'd go to food and drink, or you'd go to health and well-being. And you had a collection code above the Dewey. So you'd have this gathering of all sorts of Dewey numbers under this larger collection code. Art being probably the most popular amongst the teens, because it came down as A&F art. And yes, they had quite a lot of fun with that. But the long and the short of it was a change to the cataloguing system. Most people got used to it pretty quickly, but it didn't stop a number of people being very annoyed that we were doing weird and wonderful things, or that we were changing the way that they were used to using the library. And that kind of sparked off my interest in a bit of user-centered design, but also just a case of looking at something and going, does it serve the purpose that it's supposed to serve? So Dewey is a classification system. It classifies large amounts of material in a fashion that is presumably meant to be understandable and easy to follow. What Dewey is to the ordinary person, I feel, is a series of incomprehensible numbers. But that doesn't matter, because we've got our catalogues, and our catalogues tell us which numbers we should be looking for. And the majority of library users in a public library, I find, are going to the catalogue, finding the number that they're supposed to be looking for, and then finding that number on the shelf. We were having a discussion recently, myself and a number of other library people, about browsing and browsability, and that's where the bookstore style comes in. Being able to walk in and go, oh, there's a sign, that'll probably have the thing that I want. But probably and actually don't always match up. And so the interesting question is how you organise, particularly for libraries, a large collection. So I'm currently the branch manager of Clayton Library. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, in that library, we've got 35,000 items. I think that's about right, which is a lot of items. And so it comes down to my question and my background makes me go, okay, well, what's the system that works the best for the, and I'm very much a utilitarian. What's the system that works the best for the greatest number of people? For the greatest number of people coming into my library, what's the system that helps them find what they're looking for? Whether that's Dewey or whether that's something else. But my two questions that always pop up from there are, okay, if not Dewey, then what? And where are we getting the money from to make these changes? Because the other side that has to come along with any conversation of changing classification system is, how do you do that in a way, particularly for public libraries, how do you do that in a way that makes sense for the organisation and is affordable for the organisation to do? If you start talking a larger library service, so Casey Cardinia Libraries had 11 branches, and I could be getting that wrong, and I apologise if any of my old CCL bosses are lurking in the background. Geelong had 16 when I left, and I know there's been some adjustments there, so they might have more or less now. But it comes down to a question of, how do you make a change across that many libraries that makes sense? And when you've got people who might be coming into the library for the first time, like I was interested hearing Leonie talking about the railway library. People coming into there are, because it's a specialist library, are coming in knowing that a lot of the books they've got are probably there. People are coming to public libraries for a lot of things. But if you're going to make that change, you need to rip that Band-Aid off pretty hard and make that change pretty dramatically. Otherwise, you leave a lot of people in confusion for a lot of years if it just sort of muddles along. So I'm here posing more questions than I'm answering, but coming from the perspective of public libraries, so that will be informing any answers I give. But I know that there have been some questions popping up in the chat, so I'm very happy to keep my part very short and get to some of those questions because they are interesting and I want to know the answers as well.
Well, thank you for that, Tim. All been very interesting presentations. And just before we get to the audience questions, I'm interested to know if there are any questions or comments from the panel for each other based on what you've said.
I think mine is just the general question to everyone, which is, what do we replace Dewey with, and how do we do that in a way that works for our users, with academic libraries having the slight advantage of a summer break. So 3 months of really hard work.
Well, there was an interesting comment made by Jennifer in the audience that law libraries are actually going away from Dewey and they're now using MOS. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is still very similar to Dewey. I'm wondering if anyone else has any experience of something other than Dewey already.
I've been involved in libraries that use completely different systems. One was the Victorian Music Library, and I really can't remember what the name of the classification system was, I'm sorry, but it was just a totally different thing, and it was specifically designed to arrange music materials. This is printed music we're talking about here. So, and MOS is it's a fairly well used classification system for law, and I think there are arguments against, perhaps you've got a branch library in a university, which is the one that's using the specialist classification, and the others are using Dewey, say. It's from an economic perspective, it doesn't really make sense to have the different classification systems coexisting in terms of staff training and usage and all of that stuff. So you can see arguments for changing over, but there are certainly a range of classification systems out there that aren't Dewey, but then they're mostly designed for specific purposes.
You were talking about earlier the universal decimal classification. How's that similar and different to Dewey?
It's similar to Dewey. It's based on the same main classes, but it allows faceting, so that if you say you've got a subject in different aspects, with Dewey you've got to choose one place to put it. And in UDC, you can facet the two numbers together in various ways. So you end up with very long, lengthy numbers, which are good in a classified catalogue, not so good in a shelving as a shelving device.
The Melbourne Cricket Club Library has their own complete classification system. They just wrote it when they started, I believe. And I'm hoping our next Dewey panel is actually going to be called Different to Dewey. So just getting a small plug for that for the start of next year. So we're going to be looking at all the systems that aren't Dewey, basically. And we're hoping we're going to get the Melbourne Cricket Club Library to speak then, because yeah, they have a totally different system. It doesn't operate anywhere else as far as I know.
Well, continuing on from that sort of discussion, I thought I would segue into, we've had a couple of comments from the audience about the general public's interaction with our collections and how you can also sort of combine these subject lounge system as well as kind of like a bookshop system in the library to help with discoverability. I'm assuming those questions were mostly targeted towards like the public library setting. But I was wondering, maybe we can talk about how we have seen the public interact with Dewey and things that we have done to maybe make changes. Maybe Claire can have something to say here.
Ooh, yeah, that is it. I don't. No, I'm just trying to get my thoughts together. But if anyone else does have any quicker, but or maybe Tim, you've got public libraries.
I mean, in terms of a subject lounge, like at Geelong, we sort of added that extra layer of the genreification, which helped people find it if they were just walking into the space. What it also led to when we opened was a lot of books. Fortunately, our technical services had moved in on the 4th floor of the dome. So the books didn't have to travel very far as we sent a great number of books back to tech services who agreed with us on a lot of them. But I was constantly there finding books and going, this is entirely in the wrong spot. There is no way that this fits in this collection. Because we had given certain Dewey numbers to our suppliers and they were matching those Dewey numbers, but you'd have something, I remember one in particular stuck in my head. It was trading maps, but historical trading maps. And so they'd put it into economics because these were trade maps. But it was like, no, this does not fit in the business and IT section. Like it might have a 300 number, but it's not, it was two systems clashing against each other. So we would be sending stuff back up and I would occasionally have, not arguments, but we just have a discussion with the cataloging team because they knew I'd done everything and checked against OCLC and sort of checked everywhere I could. And then we'd have discussions about whether this was in fact the correct number or whether it just belonged in a different area. Like I remember a book of smoothie recipes went backwards and forwards between health and well-being and food and drink for about 3 weeks before we figured out a system where they could say, no, we've made our decision, don't send this back to us again. But I think the interesting thing was changing the system and adjusting the language we used was something that Claire was talking about. And it kind of sparked in me the question as well of language changes, sometimes very rapidly, but also it can change, particularly when Claire was talking about terms that are now considered derogatory. It immediately made me think of the word queer and the way that has gone from a slur to being reclaimed, and like language is constantly in flux. And so it was kind of a, how do we figure out a system that allows for that flexibility of change and some form of critical mass so that we can say this is how it's changing or being used. So I might hand over to Claire for that one. Kind of, what are your thoughts on how do we adapt to the language changing potentially in multiple directions, so that old collections that were changed because of the terms being used, that term then for whatever reason gets reclaimed and comes back into usage? How do you?
Yeah, it's very hard, very complex. And I haven't seen any large scale examples of, or like systematic changes like that, but I think maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it is, we need local. I mean, it would, yeah, I don't know, but then there's no resourcing at the local level. There's not enough resourcing for it. It's really hard. Or maybe there should be more. Yeah, it's really, I haven't seen that large scale sort of changes, but I guess they must do some. Well, actually, it's not Dewey, but a really good example for challenging, and someone did mention Library of Congress subject headings, which are also problematic. The cataloging lab is an amazing example of engaging, of making that process really, like the process to change. Yeah, I'll share a link in the chat.
Yeah. And I think I have been keeping an eye on the chat, and there's some good comments in there. And Mari's in fact talking about involving the communities in descriptions and definitions, and things like surveys and focus groups could definitely help. But I think that Deb's probably got a point in her comment of, we may be coming to a point like AACR2 versus RDA, where we look at all the different classification systems and we go, right, okay, Dewey's 100 and however many years old, time for something new. And then maybe every 150 odd years, we just relook at things. And because I was having this discussion with James recently, because yes, we discuss library stuff when we just randomly catch up. The joy of working in libraries. And yeah, we were talking about how out of date our classification system, if we created it today, how much would that be seen as outmoded or out of date in 150 years, and how would society have completely and utterly changed to them?
Yeah, and it was like, that was in relation to what could we put in place to try and make it adaptable as possible, so it didn't, I think, if I remember the conversation correctly, which kind of ties in with another, what you've just been talking about, another question from the chat that I noticed, which was about whether changing Dewey should be top down, something that ALIA and the National Library should be focusing on, or grassroots up, and be interesting to hear your thoughts on those.
I think it needs to be both. Because, I mean, one of the things that working in a small library is we can be really flexible, because to get a change through, literally it's me deciding to change it, or maybe talking to my boss deciding to change it, then physically changing the call numbers. We run our own thesaurus as well, so we don't use Library of Congress subject headings, because again, they're not specific enough, but that means I can change the wording. Like when I started, pretty much the only LGBTQI subject heading was homosexuals. That was it. So I changed it all to LGBTQA plus, and then stratified that as well. So small organizations allows that flexibility. But on the other side of the coin, you don't have the resources that big organizations have. So it's very much on a, so we have free staff. So it's on a, what can be done within man hours and with volunteer hours. We've got some very dedicated volunteers who do really help. Yeah, so, and I know from just with RDA and AARC2, the trickle down of that has taken so long. Like we do a lot of copy cataloging, and we're still, some of our stuff's AARC2, some of it's RDA, and that's coming from, a lot of it's coming from Libraries Australia. So even if we do shift to another whole system, I think BibFrame's the one that's coming through. That's going to be, by the time it gets down to grassroots level libraries, it's going to be completely out of date. So I think it needs to go both ways. I think it needs to feed up the system and down the system, and kind of meet somewhere in the middle.
maybe it could meet in the middle with metadata parties.
Yeah, I'd be on board for that.
Yeah, we can make it fun.
Yeah.
We can make, yeah, maybe that's a way to get more people involved in that process to make cataloging more accessible and more fun for everyone, and bring people together.
And just from a collection accessibility thing, one of the very small things we did was add shelf talkers. So we just put the subjects on the shelves, basically. We had got some funding for it. So it means that members could walk around and see, right, this is the section on mining, and this is the section. I basically broke the collection down into its main section. This is the family history section, and then all the different regions, which means that they can just wander and browse without actually having to switch the classification system.
I think the meeting in the middle is definitely the thing, but what it all comes down to is, in the end, is money. And I think it's interesting because Margie put up a question of where do library institutions and Dewey users feel that they are placed as customers and consumers of Dewey products, and can we influence change as consumers of the product? And I think the answer is both yes and no, because we can influence some change, but when it's a one-horse race, you've already backed the winner. There's not really necessarily those options out there. And I think for public libraries particularly, it's a lot of work. Even adding new subject headings on for Geelong was some amazing work by the collections team working with our suppliers, but it was only because we're opening up a brand new building that we could even contemplate it.
I guess a lot of that comes back to how many libraries are outsourcing cataloging and end processing as well. So a lot of books come with all their subject headings and everything pre-assigned, which is obviously it's a cost-saving strategy, which is important because every library is under-resourced. I don't know a single librarian that thinks they've got enough money to do what they need to do. But if there is anyone, I'd really love to meet them. But yes, I think it's about bringing all of that together.
I have a question from our attendees for everyone. It sort of ties into a bit like whether it's a top-down issue or what grassroots issue is. To everyone, do your technical or cataloging staff actually spend time on the floor and know why or understand why they are classifying?
At Monash currently, no is the answer, but I do want to bring in, because again, as I said, I've worked at Melton previously, and Deb put in the chat, Deb from Melton, when she first started cataloging, she wasn't allowed to spend time on the floor, but forced the issue, and in the current structure, you spend all of the tech services staff at Melton, at least when I was working there, spend time on the floor. They've got at least one shift or part of their shift when they're out on the floor each week. And so that means that not only did it mean that you were working with the tech services staff at the time, it also meant that if you had any queries, it was a case of talking to the person who was next to you on the desk and going, oh, that's interesting. And I can remember working shifts with Deb and kind of going, hang on, this seems weird. And then we were able to have a discussion on the floor as we were putting stuff away and going, why is this catalogued like this? And sometimes finding out why it was and going, okay, that makes sense now. And sometimes just there going, okay, put that to one side. And then Deb would finish her shift on the floor and walk out the back with the book to recatalogue it.
If I might just comment from the point of view of a school's cataloguing service, where none of the cataloguers are in a position to be on the floor other than the floor of the office or the home in which they're doing their cataloguing. So it's really, I guess it's up to those cataloguers to have a thorough understanding of the standards that have been established in conjunction with the library users, who are the school librarians, who are the experts, and also to be responsive if we do get feedback from our customers, which we do quite readily. And so, yes, there's it's not always possible, but I do agree that if you can achieve that, then it is a wonderful way for tech services staff to have a good understanding of the user needs.
What about Claire with academic focus?
Very siloed traditionally, and so not a lot of collaboration between technical services and others. But it's starting to change, I think, as we're all doing more with less. We're all kind of working together a bit more, which has some benefits of definitely collaboration and building understanding across teams. Yeah, so it is starting to change a little bit. And I think one area in particular, and this has partly been inspired by the University of Newcastle's work, the GlamX lab work. Yeah, it's, I think, around special collections cataloguing in academic libraries. Yeah, that's kind of an area where we're starting to bring knowledge from across the library and beyond, like archives and galleries and at universities. And I think, yeah, so it's been a really good good opportunity to build understanding of what we all do and bring to collection, like the knowledge that we bring to collections and the different approaches. Yeah, and we're starting to do a bit. Yeah, it's been really good.
From a small special library perspective, we don't have different departments. So I do most of the cataloguing and I work front desk as well, but my boss catalogues too. So yeah, between us, and if we have a discussion over subject headings, we just sit down and talk about it, and all over Dewey and work out where we're going to put the book. If it's anything railway related, I just let him decide. But apart from that, we usually talk about it. But yeah, we both work front of house and on phones and everything as well. So there is a lot of overlap, and that, as I said, it's one of the advantages of special libraries. And we do everything in-house, which is unusual. So we can process everything too. So we've got a very dedicated team of book coverers, one of whom I can see in the audience, who does all our book carrying and book covering as well. So yeah, we don't outsource anything, but that is by and large a question of funding. If we could outsource it, like I do all the ordering too. So we do pretty much everything in-house, which is unusual these days. But yeah, if we could outsource it, we probably would, but yeah, it costs more money than we have.
Well, thank you everyone for answering those questions. I think I may bring the questions back around to something that was mentioned in the chat very early on, was we are talking a lot about Dewey, but not about subject headings, and they can be extremely problematic. And there was a question specifically from Natasha for Leonie regarding the CIS catalogue subject headings. One I have come across recently that I'm troubled about is Australia, Discovery and Exploration, which is applied to post-European settlement of Australia. Has CIS considered removing the discovery aspect of this heading and perhaps adding European as a qualifier to the exploration aspect?
That's a fabulous thing to raise, Natasha. And SCIS does have a process for reviewing subject headings, and I'll certainly add that onto the list. If you wanted to, I mean, I can add it, but to give feedback to you specifically or to continue the discussion with you, it'd be great if you could just drop a line to help@scissdata.com and we can take the conversation on further. But yes, there's quite a lot in SCIS subject headings, and no doubt in other subject heading schemes that are a reflection of the colonial past, definitely, because they've been established for such a long time. SCIS was based on Library of Congress subject headings originally, and they, as you know, they go back a very long way. So yeah, we're certainly open to reviewing any terminology that is now seen as inappropriate. So thank you very much for raising that.
Yeah, I've just emailed myself to remind me to check, because I think we use discovery and exploration, but it might be explorers and exploration. I think adding European onto is actually a really good idea, so I'll do that next week probably.
Oh, brilliant. You've just found more work for yourself, Ellen. I love it.
Okay, well, I've got a bit of a curly question, not from the chat, but this is from my experience working at TAFE, teaching the Library and Information, the Diploma of Library and Information Services course. And I'm interested to know your views on how much you see library education as helping to make helping to make Dewey better, or how much of the library education is continuing to promote bad aspects of Dewey? Probably a good one for Claire.
I was pretty excited about that question. I have heard that it's better than it was when I was studying. Now I think it's getting better. I've heard Holly White at Curtin is particularly good. Yeah, has a really good approach to critiquing cataloging systems. Yeah, it was a great question. I don't think it was great when I was doing it, really, to be honest. And yeah, I think the yeah, it was much more about just applying the existing systems and challenging them. There was a little bit about radical cataloging, but I had to go like it was basically just in the footnotes. Yeah, and it was amazing when I did discover them. At least they were mentioned a little bit. I have heard good things that's changing. That they're getting out there more.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Again, I went at the same time Claire did. Obviously, we studied together for a while, and there wasn't anything that really, or at least I didn't encounter anything that particularly encouraged the critical engagement with Dewey and looking at it and going, here is how this information came about. And in terms of that idea of Melville Dewey was many things not, and a lot of them not very nice, in terms of how we see the world today. So I think that there's definitely, and I would hope that it's been done, but if you do the library course and then you go out and you're working, you're not necessarily going to challenge the assumptions in library course until you run into something that breaks the paradigm or that forces you to look at that and go, oh, that's problematic. And often, and particularly as a newer librarian, you might be running into that, and if there's not support higher up, then you run into that and you just get told, well, that's the way it always is, or that's the way it works. And then it's like, yeah, but it could be better, but you never have the time or the money to. Like, what I would love to see is an idea where it's, here is the classification system, and it's broad classifications. And then the idea is that it is a requirement that your library service hires a cataloger whose job is to narrow it down to your local area, or whatever the agreed sort of area is. So if you end up with, and we've been talking about it for years, and we'll probably talk about it for years more, but if you end up with some sort of one card Victoria system, then you'd hope that across those public libraries you would have some regularity of subject headings, and so you'd have that across that system. But you'd be required to have staff whose job is to make sure that you're, like, they'd have the areas open, but they wouldn't do that. And the idea would be that there would be someone who is drilling down to that level of stratification for your library service. Because it's, yeah, there are many, many difficulties with Dewey, and how we deal with them often does depend on who's actually doing the dealing and what they learnt in library school, however long ago that may have been.
Yeah, I did my Master's of Information at CSU. I think I started in 2013 and finished 2015, so just a little bit after Tim and Claire. And I was unusual in it that I'd never worked in a library before doing the Masters, so I didn't have any of the practical training. A lot of other people in that particular Masters course were upskilling. So I learned classification a bit more theoretically, and then learned it practically. It was partly through the subjects I picked, then learned it practically actually at the PMI. So the reason I've sort of ended up reinventing bits of it was because I was learning as I went. And my previous manager trained me sort of in what the PMI did. And then once I got a bit more comfortable with that and had the autonomy, I just sort of started poking around the edges and changing things, which kind of worked. So yeah, I definitely think it could filter back up more into library information studies. I'm marking some subjects for CSU at the moment as well. And I think it's starting to. I think that sort of critical thinking is starting to filter back up, but like everything, it just takes time, unfortunately. And like libraries, like information courses are underfunded and under-resourced, as always.
That's great. Have any more from chat? Any more questions from chat there, Jade?
I mean, I'd like to answer Ben's question in the chat, which is, how do you determine what is an appropriate number when thinking about current Dewey bias, US focus / language, plus your own bias in the confines of Dewey, etc.? My broad response is I steal from a variety of different mythologies, but an it harm none, do as ye will. What I try and do if I'm looking at any sort of classification is I'm going, okay, is this classification likely to offend or embarrass or discommode a person who identifies as whatever is being discussed? So again, coming from a queer perspective, but I'm also aware that I also tend to come from a white cis male perspective as well. So it's like, I can mostly pass and I can mostly look at systems and go, oh, it's fine. But then it's like, no, is this idea is being presented in this number as this? Is that going to cause someone harm? Because if it is, I need to try and remove that. And then beyond that, it's just what's going to work for the library users.
Thank you for that answer, Tim. I do have a couple more questions I would like to express from our audience. I've been madly trying to catalogue our questions into sort of themes so that at least everybody's ideas get heard. We do have one from Marie for Claire in particular. I think we may have touched on this in our discussions, but I wanted to make sure that this particular question got answered. So Claire, your concept around input from communities, around descriptions and definitions is great. And what can you suggest to improve this? Focus groups or surveys, or is there any other method that you have seen or that you'd like to try that you think could work?
I haven't really done it or seen much on a large scale again, but I think, yeah, just probably what I've done it is in classes. So in information literacy training is where I would sort of have or raise points for discussion. And yeah, I think that's a good place to gather that. And I think maybe as well, also again with special collections cataloguing, because I think that is an example of where Dewey is really not appropriate. Like, you're very rarely, like, and very clearly, and yeah, and where it has been applied in somewhat problematic ways. So we're like and it's a small sort of collection as well. Or they are small collections, so we can do like little pilot small experiments in cataloguing as a gateway. Yeah, I'm trying to think, like I have seen examples of like community engagement with it's more in collection development than classification.
Well,
yeah,
if you do have those examples, we will be getting your slides in this presentation
Yes,
as well,
true.
won't we? Well, if you do have anything else that you can think of, Claire, that wasn't in your slides, maybe you can send those links to either myself or anyone else on the ALIA committee, because when I put this recording up on YouTube, I've actually been grabbing all of the links that people have been sharing as well. So I thought I might as well share those in the description of the video too.
Links, contact details, all of that will definitely go in the description. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not exactly specifically related to classification that I can think of, but Tim's point reminded me of great work is like a harm minimization approach to library and information services work. So I've just linked to a blog post there. I highly recommend. Yeah, and it was a good series of blog posts as well, actually, and that was just the first one there. And there's a few practical applications of it in like more recent posts. Yeah, I'll have a think there.
Oh, thank you very much, Claire. And I do have one more question. I think maybe
just very quickly, Jade. From what Leonie was saying, SCIS seems to have quite a robust feedback system for anyone that's got any issues with how things are categorised.
SCIS system, Schools Catalogue Information Service, yes, has feedback mechanisms for users to contact us if they have any issues at all with their catalogue records. So yes, that's part of the service.
And that seems to be a very strong theme for today, is that we do need to continue working together, not only within our own library people groups, but also with our consumers and people who are using Dewey. There needs to be that constant communication so that the improvements that we hope to see can be made. But yes,
on that, oh, sorry, go on, Jade.
No, you go.
I was going to say on that, we've been going for a bit over an hour, and it's getting on for time to start wrapping it up. So I was going to say, if we can all work together to thank the panelists for very interesting presentations and a very interesting discussion afterwards. It was it was great having you all, so thank you. And I think Ellen has something.
I do. For Leonie and Claire, unfortunately, we can't present them to you in person, but I am going to post them to you. So we both, oh, hang on, turn my background off for a second. I haven't thought of this problem. Background. Sorry, there we go. Sorry, PMI can go away for a second. We have ALIA VIC mugs. So we have one for each of you as a thank you for the time and dedication you've given to presenting on our panel, which we really appreciate. And I will get them in the post to you at some point in the next week. So they should turn up within the next 6 months, knowing Australia Post. So thank you very much. We really appreciate the time we've taken to engage in what's obviously a wide topic that has a lot of wide interest, and yeah, to bring both your areas of expertise to the panel. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. And apologies again for being way over.
No, it was very
fine. I think I was over as well. I think everyone was a little fine.
Now, before we go on to other stuff, and hold on, I'm going to look really weird as I try and spotlight Margie Anderson, who's the ALIA VIC State Manager, who's asked for a bit of time to talk about some ALIA stuff at the end of our session. So take it away, Margie. You're muted, Margie.
Technology. Still muted. Asked to unmute. There we go.
Thank you. Sorry, you had to unmute me. Hello, everybody. What a fantastic session. Nice to spend Sunday afternoon with you. I would like to thank not only our speakers today, but I really would like to thank the ALIA VIC committee members for putting together this session and for all the fantastic work that they have done for us, particularly over the last 18 months, 2 years during our COVID lockdown. One of the things that the ALIA VIC committee did very early on in the lockdown process was step up and say, how can we support Victorian libraries through non-face-to-face activities? And they've just done a fantastic job of putting together professional development activities, networking activities, some really fun things to keep our spirits up, like the trivia nights, the events like these. So on behalf of everybody who's really enjoyed the benefits of your labour, thank you very much to all the members of the ALIA VIC committee. Now, it takes a certain sort of person to work on an ALIA committee because it takes a lot of dedication and a lot of hard work. And one of the ways that we like to be able to say thank you to our ALIA volunteers is to award them a silver pin. Silver pins are provided as thanks to ALIA members who have worked in the service of ALIA, either on committees or specialist events, or perhaps working with peers on projects like conferences and so on for a period of 5 years. So you need to have a sustained effort there, and it takes a lot of work to keep coming back and a lot of dedication to keep coming back time after time for that period. I have some silver pins that I would like to present today. I was hoping that I could come and present them in person, but I'm going to take this opportunity to do it because, as we know, we're never quite sure when we're going to get back together again. So let's do this remotely now, and then when we get back together face to face, we can shake the hands of the recipients. Our first recipient is Ellen, who is one of the co-conveners of ALIA VIC. So Ellen, I do have here for you your silver pin.
Oh, thank you.
A letter from Sue McErica, the CEO of ALIA, who is wants me to present this in recognition of the service that you've given to the association, both as an ALIA VIC committee member and the co-convener, and also for work on NLS 9 as well. So
thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I had absolutely no idea, so I really appreciate that.
Silver pin will be in the mail, and I'll hold out to do a gold pin at some point for you.
Thank you.
I also have one for our other co-convener, James Baker. James has been very busy, both with ALIA VIC, New Librarian Symposium, the ALIA comic and book group as well. So James, thank you so much for your contribution. I have an ALIA silver pin for you as well, coming directly from me to you via Sue McErica and the ALIA board. Thank you very much for all of the effort that you have put in, because it's been substantial and we are really grateful. The next person that I have to award a pin to is the person who took a lot of RSVPs for this event and has been doing a whole lot of work in the background. Here's the secretary of ALIA VIC, Michael Barry. Michael, the secretary's job is a thankless task. So we are here to make sure that we thank you. So as well, we have your silver pin for you. Thank you, Michael. On behalf of everybody here and all of the people who have enjoyed the fruits of your labour, we appreciate you. And finally, somebody whose list of contributions was way too long to even fit on my recommendation when I sent it off to ALIA House for a silver pin. Jade Coco, who has been a person who's been contributing to the running of ALIA as a volunteer for such a long time and really has put in an enormous amount of effort. So Jade's been on the ALIA VIC committee, the ALIA URLs committee. She was the ACT SNG convener. She's been on the New Librarian Symposium committee. So, you know, you can't keep a good woman down. And Jade is exactly that person. So Jade, thank you very much and congratulations from everybody at ALIA for your silver pin as well.
Thank you so much.
And I know there are other members of the team who also work tirelessly. So we'd like to thank them, and we'll be here when they reach their 5-year milestone to pat them on the back too. So in the meantime, congratulations, Ellen, James, Michael, and Jade. Job well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very unexpected.
Yeah,
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was certainly not what I was expecting when Margie asked for a couple of minutes at the end of the session today. So thank you. Yeah, very surprised.
Oh, you're welcome. You've all done a fantastic job.
So speaking of the job that ALIA VIC committee has been doing, this is the first part of, I thought so. This is the first part of what we intend to be a 3-part panel session. The second one, we're looking at the first half of next year, and the third one, the second half of next year. And it's going to continue with looking at cataloging. The next one, different to Dewey. So classification systems that aren't Dewey, and how they differ from Dewey, what the pros and cons of them are. That's what we're looking at for there. And then the last one is about what getting into the nuts and bolts of the classification systems. What makes a classification system work? What doesn't? How could we potentially make a classification system that would last better than we've seen that Dewey has? So yeah, keep an eye out for those on ALIA VIC's socials. Their e-list is back up and running, so join that. And yeah, and it'll appear in ALIA stuff as well. And more immediately than those, we're looking at doing something around Halloween. If we can get together in person, hopefully we'll be able to do that. If not, there'll be something online. And we're also looking at another trivia night on November the 21st. So, and again, keep your eyes on ALIA VIC's social media for more information about those.